January 29th, 1945. The Belgian village of Holzheim lies buried under 3 feet of snow, and First Sergeant Leonard Alfred Funk, Jr. stands in the center of a farmhouse courtyard with 80 German soldiers pointing rifles at his chest. Funk is 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighs 140 pounds soaking wet, which makes him the smallest paratrooper in Company C of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 80 Psych and Airborne Division. He is also, at this particular moment, the most dangerous man in Belgium. Funk had spent the last 4 hours clearing German positions from 15 houses along the edge of Holzheim, with a ragtag collection of clerks, cooks, and supply sergeants, men who had never expected to see combat, but who followed Funk into battle because he was the kind of NCO who led from the front. They had captured 80 prisoners in the process, more than they could guard with their exhausted, half-strength unit. Funk had left the prisoners under the watch of 4 men while he personally scouted the remaining buildings. And now, returning to the courtyard, he finds that a German patrol has reversed the situation entirely. His 4 guards are disarmed and standing with their hands up. The 80 prisoners have reclaimed their weapons, and a German officer is screaming orders in Funk's face while shoving an MP-40 submachine gun into his stomach. The officer is demanding Funk's surrender. The other 79 Germans are waiting for Funk to drop his weapon. And Leonard Funk, exhausted, outnumbered, and staring down the barrel of a gun held by an enemy who has every advantage, does something that no one, least of all the Germans, expects. He starts laughing, not a nervous chuckle or a bitter laugh of resignation, but a full, genuine belly laugh that echoes across the frozen courtyard and makes absolutely no sense to anyone present. The German officer stops shouting. The other Germans exchange confused glances. Funk keeps laughing, reaches slowly for his Thompson submachine gun as if preparing to surrender it, and then, in a blur of motion that lasts less than 3 seconds, swings the weapon up, kills the German officer with a burst to the chest, and opens fire on the rest of the stunned enemy soldiers. What happens next will last 45 seconds, result in 21 dead Germans and dozens more wounded or surrendering, and earn Leonard Funk the Medal of Honor. But the real story is not what Funk did in those 45 seconds. The real story is how a 5'5" coal miner from Pennsylvania became the most decorated paratrooper in the 80 Psych and Airborne Division, and how he understood something about combat that most soldiers never learn: that violence, at its core, is a contest of will, and the man who seizes the initiative in the moment when everyone else hesitates will win, no matter the odds. By January 1945, the mathematics of infantry combat in World War II were well established and brutally clear. A surrounded soldier, facing 80 armed enemy troops, had 3 options. He could surrender and hope for mercy. He could fight and die within seconds. Or he could run and hope to be shot in the back rather than captured. What he could not do, what no tactical manual, no combat instructor, no reasonable assessment of the situation would ever suggest, was attempt to fight his way out. The numbers were simply too overwhelming. An experienced rifleman could fire perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute with a bolt-action rifle. A submachine gunner with a Thompson M1A1 could empty a 30-round magazine in approximately 2 seconds at full automatic, which meant that even if every bullet hit its target, the gunner would run out of ammunition long before he ran out of enemies. The psychological factors were even worse. A surrounded soldier under the guns of 80 enemies was expected to be terrified, disoriented, and focused entirely on survival rather than aggression. The enemy soldiers, by contrast, held every advantage. They had numbers, firepower, defensive positions, and the confidence that comes from having already won the engagement. No soldier in that position would dare to attack. And that universal assumption, that unbreakable rule of infantry combat, was exactly what Leonard Funk intended to exploit. Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. was born on August 27, 1916, in Braddock Township, Pennsylvania, a coal mining community outside Pittsburgh where men measured their lives in tons of coal extracted and shifts worked without injury. Funk's father was a coal miner. His uncles were coal miners. The expectation was that Leonard would follow them into the mines, spend 40 years underground, and die of black lung in his 50s like most men in the valley. Funk had other ideas. He was small for his age, barely clearing 5 feet by the time he turned 16, and the mining companies preferred larger men who could swing a pickaxe for 12-hour shifts without collapsing. Funk worked odd jobs instead, delivering newspapers, stocking shelves, doing manual labor for construction crews. And when the war came in 1941, he enlisted in the Army at age 25, hoping to avoid being drafted into an infantry unit where his small stature would be a liability. The recruiter took one look at Funk's size and suggested the Paratroopers. Airborne units, the recruiter explained, preferred smaller men, less weight to drop out of an airplane, easier to fit through the door of a C-47. Funk thought the recruiter was joking. Jumping out of airplanes sounded like the worst job in the entire military. But the paratroopers offered extra pay, $50 a month jump pay on top of base salary, and Funk needed the money. He signed the papers, reported to Fort Benning, Georgia, for training, and discovered that being small in the paratroopers was not a disadvantage. It was a superpower. Funk could run faster, pack tighter, and land harder than the larger men in his platoon, and his low center of gravity made him nearly impossible to knock down in hand-to-hand combat drills. By the time he completed jump school in 1942, Funk was a private in Company C, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 86th 2nd Airborne Division. By 1944, after jumps into Normandy and Holland, he was a first sergeant leading an entire company. And by January 1945, he had survived more combat than most soldiers would see in 3 wars. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 had shattered the Allied advance across Belgium and forced the 82nd Airborne into a desperate defensive stand in waist-deep snow against German panzer divisions trying to punch through to Antwerp. Funk's company had been understrength since Normandy, and by the time they reached Holzheim in late January, he was leading a unit that consisted mostly of replacements, cooks, clerks, and supply personnel. Men with minimal combat training who had been pressed into frontline service because there was no one else available. They trusted Funk because he had kept them alive through 3 days of brutal fighting, and because Funk led every assault personally. Thompson submachine gun in hand, charging German positions with a reckless disregard for his own safety that somehow inspired confidence rather than terror. On the morning of January 29, 1945, Funk received orders to clear the remaining German holdouts from Holzheim. Intelligence estimated fewer than 20 enemy soldiers in the village. Funk assembled his makeshift platoon, about 20 men total, most of them armed with M1 Garands and 1 Browning automatic rifle, and moved into the village at 800 hours. By 1100 hours, they had cleared 15 houses and captured 80 German soldiers, far more than intelligence had predicted. Funk's problem was that he did not have enough men to guard that many prisoners while simultaneously continuing to clear buildings. He detailed 4 soldiers to watch the prisoners in a farmhouse courtyard, ordered them to shoot anyone who moved, and continued the sweep with the rest of his men. It took less than 30 minutes for everything to go wrong. The German prisoners in the courtyard had not been searched thoroughly. Several still had concealed knives and pistols. A German patrol, roughly 30 men who had been hiding in a barn on the outskirts of the village, heard the gunfire from Funk's sweep, circled behind the American lines, and moved into the courtyard where the prisoners were being held. The 4 American guards, outnumbered and surprised, surrendered without firing a shot. The German prisoners reclaimed their rifles from the pile where they had been stacked. And when Funk returned to the courtyard at 11:47 hours, expecting to find his guards standing watch over 80 disarmed prisoners, he instead found himself staring at 80 armed Germans and a screaming officer who was demanding his immediate surrender. Funk assessed the situation in approximately 2 seconds. His own men were scattered across Holzheim, out of earshot and unaware that the prisoners had been liberated. The Germans held every tactical advantage. There was no cover in the courtyard. No support was coming. Funk could surrender, or he could die. Those were the only rational options. And Leonard Funk, who had spent 4 years jumping out of airplanes into enemy territory, who had fought his way across France and Belgium with a company of clerks and cooks, who had learned in the coal mines of Pennsylvania that the only way to survive was to refuse to quit, decided that he would rather die laughing than live on his knees. Funk started laughing not because he thought the situation was funny, but because laughter was the last thing the Germans expected. The German officer stopped shouting. The other Germans hesitated, confused by the reaction. Funk kept laughing, louder now, and slowly reached for his Thompson, as if preparing to hand it over. The German officer relaxed slightly, assuming Funk was surrendering. And in that fraction of a second, Funk swung the Thompson up in a single fluid motion, flipped the selector to full automatic, and fired a burst into the German officer's chest from a range of less than 3 feet. The officer collapsed instantly. Funk pivoted left, firing controlled bursts into the nearest cluster of German soldiers, then pivoted right, emptying the rest of his magazine into the Germans on the opposite side of the courtyard. He dropped the empty magazine, reloaded from his belt, and kept firing. The entire sequence lasted approximately 5 seconds. The Germans, stunned by the sudden violence and the death of their officer, hesitated. And in that hesitation, Funk's 4 American guards, who had been standing with their hands up, disarmed and waiting to be marched into captivity, dove for the weapons pile and opened fire. The German prisoners, caught in the crossfire, scattered. Some threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Others tried to return fire and were cut down. The German patrol that had liberated the prisoners retreated toward the barn, firing wildly as they ran. Funk, standing in the center of the courtyard with his Thompson, systematically shot anyone who moved. The firefight lasted 45 seconds. When it ended, 21 Germans were dead. Another 24 were wounded. The rest had surrendered for the second time that day. Funk reloaded his Thompson, ordered his men to secure the prisoners again, and continued clearing the village as if nothing unusual had happened. His official after-action report listed the engagement as minor contact with enemy forces, and made no mention of the laughter or the odds he had faced. But the story spread through the 82nd Airborne like wildfire. And by the time Funk returned to battalion headquarters that evening, he was already a legend. On September 5th, 1945, 8 months after the firefight in Holzheim, Leonard Funk stood in the East Room of the White House and received the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman. The citation read in part, "First Sergeant Funk's bold action and heroic disregard for his own safety were directly responsible for the capture of a vastly superior enemy force and prevented heavy casualties among his own men." Truman shook Funk's hand, told him he was a credit to the uniform, and moved on to the next recipient. Funk returned to Pennsylvania, married his high school sweetheart, and took a job as a railroad worker. He never spoke publicly about the war. He never wrote a memoir. He never sought attention or glory. When reporters asked him about the Holtzheim firefight, he shrugged and said, "I did what anyone would have done." But that was not true, and Funk knew it. What he did in that courtyard was not what anyone would have done. It was what only one man in 1,000 would have dared to do. And only if that man understood that warfare is not decided by firepower or numbers or tactical advantage. It is decided by will. Funk died of cancer on August 20th, 1992, at the age of 76. He was the last living Medal of Honor recipient from the 82nd Airborne Division's World War II campaigns. His funeral was attended by paratroopers from 3 generations, men who had heard the stories and wanted to pay their respects to a soldier who had embodied everything the airborne stood for: courage, audacity, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The lesson of Leonard Funk is not that smaller soldiers can fight better than larger ones, or that laughter is an effective combat tactic, or that 45 seconds of violence can change the outcome of a battle. The lesson is that the most dangerous weapon in any engagement is the soldier who refuses to accept the script that everyone else is following. The Germans in that courtyard expected Funk to surrender because that is what surrounded soldiers do. They expected him to be terrified because that is what outnumbered soldiers feel. They expected him to behave predictably, and in that expectation, they gave Funk the only advantage he needed: surprise. The Thompson submachine gun that Funk carried into Holtzheim was not homemade, as some later accounts claimed. It was a standard-issue M1A1, mass-produced by the Auto Ordnance Corporation and distributed to every airborne unit in the European theater. But in Funk's hands, it became something more than a weapon. It became an extension of a will that refused to break, a refusal to accept the mathematics of death that said 80 armed men will always defeat one. Funk did not win that firefight because he was a better shot, or because he was faster, or because he had more ammunition. He won because he understood that combat is a human endeavor, and the human who acts when everyone else hesitates will seize the initiative and never let go. That understanding, more than any weapon or any tactic, is what made Leonard Funk the most dangerous 5'5" paratrooper in the history of the United States Army.